Okie dokie. We're starting the deployment mini series thing. This is part one. Don't worry about the Death Watch and whether they have rules in the background. All right.
All right. Okay, so I've done a class on deployment, and like a lot of people have a lot of questions, and this seems to be one of the biggest things in 40K as far as everything in 40K is like a snowball effect. If you mess something up early, it affects the rest of the game, so even a small mistake early sometimes is more detrimental than a big mistake later. Missing out on a couple of victory points is one thing, like move blocking yourself so that you can't get out of your deployment zone until turn 3 is giant. It could totally cost you the game. So this little mini series, we're going to start with various different parts of deployment, because it is also basically a giant mini game inside the actual game of 40K. So for starters, we want to understand a few basics. You want to have a generalized plan in your head when you are building your list, understanding terrain, getting to the table, and starting to set up deployment zones and terrain, objective markers. And one of the best things I can suggest is by categorizing the different deployment zones. This is one thing that I do a little different than other people, which is why I want to bring it up. Basically, there's 3 different categories of deployment zones. You have the long edges. There's 2 different ones of that. It's like long, thin edge that we're used to for a long time. In the current Nexus mission deck, there's like a little sidestep long edge one where it's extra thin for half of the deployment zone and a little thicker for the other half of the deployment zone, but it's still the long edge. That is one group, and it has its own challenges, kind of regardless of terrain setup or who you're facing, things like that. Next group is fat ends. That's the short table edge. I think there's 3 different deployment zones for this one. Some people argue there's 2, but I'm going to say there's 3. And it's, the normal fat end that we're used to. Then you have the little sidestep thing for the current mission. And then you basically have the kind of diagonal deployment zone where it goes middle of table to opposite corner. And I treat all 3 of those as kind of a similar deployment style, because the challenges that you get when trying to navigate the terrain and hold objectives, and when do you run into your opponent, or when do you have space to kind of spread out, sort of thing, these all kind of clump together to me. As the third category, I treat it as table quarters. Table quarters, again, is very similar to the diagonal deployment zone as far as where you're placing your models and things like that, but it has a couple of distinctive things about it that make it very different, in that table quarters is the closest you can get to your opponent and their deployment zone out of any deployment before the game starts. They're the closest. They are less than 18 inches from each other, from the corner of the circle to the corner of the circle. And most deployment zones, actually like all of them, have at least a 20 to 24 inch gap, sometimes 30, or at least we've had that in the past, but not right now, gap between them. So you can get extremely close right off your deployment. At the same time, table quarters also, because the way they're set up, you can get the farthest away from your opponent that you possibly could pretty quickly, because you can kind of follow the short edge of the table and get out to a far corner and still be extremely far away from your opponent and their deployment zone, much easier than you could on any other deployment, because there's normally a much more balanced kind of distance between everything for the other deployments. Going backwards, the fed end deployment does have some challenges, in that with those you could deploy extremely far back into your deployment zone and create space for your gun line or whatever else. Obviously, some of this space isn't good for you, because line of sight blocking, if you're playing gun line, you can't actually shoot from back there unless you have indirect fire. It could be good for you because if you're far enough back, assault armies couldn't possibly charge you like turn 1 or even turn 2, maybe, depending on how far back you go. There are advantages and disadvantages, but these are a different set of problems than some of the others. Long edges, their specific issue, we'll call it, but it's not really an issue, challenge, is that you can spread your forces out so thin that when you have factions that really like to have auras, or whether it's they're playing a Guilliman or they're playing Necrons have a ton of auras, and those auras tend to be fairly small, like 3 inches on several things. Forcing your opponent to spread out in order to hold even just the neutral zone objectives, because they're so much farther apart than others, other deployment zones, creates a separate set of issues. There's no direct answer here as far as like what faction you're playing and how far you spread out and whether or not you cram yourself into the back of the deployment zone. We'll go over a bunch of other stuff throughout the other parts of the video, or the miniseries, but this is mostly just having a solid understanding of you're probably going to have 3 different challenges that you need to kind of understand from deployment that are almost entirely unaffected by your opponent and what they're doing just by the design of the deployment zones and where the objectives are placed based upon those.
Yeah, don't pay attention to them. They don't matter.
They do, but it's one of those things that, like, most people that I've explained this to, they have never really thought of it this way. Like, even the people who kind of understand, like, the complexities of, like, the long edge compared to, like, the fat end deployment zones, even if they kind of understood that, understanding those problems and actually taking time to, like, look at my list, set up a table maybe if you have, like, some time while you're waiting on your opponent to show up or whatever else, at your, like, local store or basement, whatever. But just, like, kind of thinking about, like, okay, but if we go thin deployment zones, my aura really hurts. Or in order to make my aura still work, I have to, like, heavy one side. I can't just force the middle and then spread out. Or I can't, like, try to get the 2 outsides. Like, I have to, like, the way my list is built, I have to choose a side early on, and then I have to go heavy on that side. And when I do that, do I have enough that I can, like, contest my opponent on my weak side? Or am I just easily giving up that side, that sort of thing?
So speaking of not paying attention to your opponent, I think the long edge struggle is screening. If you're really worried about deep strikes and ingresses and stuff, ooh, it's not a good look, because as soon as you move up, it's like inevitable you're going to make enough space in the back corners.
Yep, that's absolutely true. Well, long edges have a lot of challenges that just don't exist in the others. Table quarters can get some of that, but table quarters is wild how it has, like, a problem from each of the types and then creates its own problem of being so much closer than all the other deployment zones to your opponent.
Also, like, infiltrating in the circle is very funny.
It is. Especially when you're, like, infiltrating in the circle, like, starts to create, like, a wave pattern because you had to get around the little nub that is their deployment zone.
Yeah.
I've seen people do that before.
Anyway, I want to add that long edge is hot dog and fat end is hamburger.
It's true.
And table quarters, I'm going to call it lasagna.
Oh, cool. I hate that.
Okay.